So Craig, how are you feeling today?
You know, when I came into this room, I felt like I needed a therapy session. I'm feeling good, but there's a lot on my mind after the last few days at this conference, and this couch just got me right into a therapist-patient mindset.
That's good. That's exactly what we need. You know, I was actually planning on doing something like this, a discussion like this, with Gil Bash, but unfortunately he couldn't join us. So I wrote to him yesterday and I said, Gil, I'm really sorry that you can't come, but I got Craig to give me an interview, so he's going to be your backup. So not a replacement, a backup. And you know what he said? He said, you got Craig. He's not a backup. He's an upgrade. So what do you have to say to that?
I have to say that now you've set a bar of expectation for your audience that I will never be able to live up to, but as long as you can get a session with Gil at a later date, your audience will be happy.
Tell me a little bit more about, your thoughts around digital health and AI. You work and observe the clinical trial space, the pharma space. You used to work for Pfizer. So in the presentation that you had at this conference, the Digital Health and AI Innovation Summit, you kind of focused on the critique of corporate management, the fact that corporations move too slowly and in a way avoid innovation because they are risk averse. So I actually want to know what inspires you in digital health and AI at the moment.
There's so much opportunity with digital health and AI to impact clinical trials. There's a reason why innovators and digital disruptors and investors are drawn to clinical research as an opportunity today. In many ways, in pharma, discovery, embrace innovation, commercial organizations do as well, but clinical development tends to be overly risk averse. And I'll say overly because there are opportunities to use digital and AI in our process that can actually reduce risk and improve quality. And yet even those don't get to see proper daylight because change is so difficult in these organizations. I think my critique of these organizations is they make digital optional, and we don't treat it with the same sense of urgency that we do other change initiatives in our companies. Let's face it, pharma companies know how to reorganize. They certainly know how to make change happen in their org chart. They know how to change big tech platforms. If a clinical development organization was changing their electronic data capture or CTMS from one system to another, they would hire a bunch of consultants, allocate a bunch of internal resources, and they'd have a change date. And on that date, they would switch from the old to the new, or somebody would be held accountable. And yet with these digital and AI-based opportunities, they're not treating it with the same sense of urgency. And even though we use rhetoric about being patient-centric and the like, if we really are, then we should be acting with the urgency that patients expect of us. And I don't believe that we are. And so my call for leaders here is to actually lead and not try to move everybody in the organization through a change curve concurrently, because then we're all appeasing the lowest common denominator in our org, and it dilutes the impact of what we can actually do. I think now is the time we actually have to lead. And leadership here means drawing a line in the sand between the old and the new, and choosing dates and setting targets for when we will meaningfully embrace these new digital opportunities to improve medicine development.
I'm sure that based on all the presentations that we had in the use of digital technologies and wearables for things like measuring steps, gait, to assess motor function. So instead of getting a snapshot of information about a patient, you actually get a longitudinal data. And it was also mentioned that some of these decisions are used for internal decision making. They're not included in the kind of the regulatory landscape just because the regulation is so strict. So what do you have to say to that? How much do you observe that the regulation has changed Because regulation is one of the things that's the number one enemy of change, at least it's mentioned as such.
Personally, I think that we over-index on relying on using regulation as a scapegoat, on pointing to regulation and policy as if it is the true barrier to the adoption of innovation. I'll pick on an easy example. We've had guidance in the US on using electronic informed consent now for several years. We have had guidance in the US on using electronic source data, meaning strategies, for example, that we could link EHRs to EDC systems to reduce redundant data entry. All of these digital innovations have regulatory clarity. And likewise, we have clear pathways with the regulators around digital health technologies and how to develop and qualify new digital measurements. We in industry know how to introduce new measurement outcomes. We've done this for years with wet biomarkers and other types of diagnostics. And so it's an easy fallback. It's an easy excuse to say the regulation is the barrier, the regulation is the challenge. There is a regulatory expectation. We do have to invest in qualifying and validating the measurements we're looking to introduce. And of course, with any of these innovations, patient safety and data integrity will always remain our top priorities. But it's a little too easy for us to stand up and honestly point to the regulators alone as the primary reason for the lack of adoption.
You're a consultant, right?
I do some advising work with companies. I have a few board roles with different organizations. I co-chair a nonprofit collaboration that brings together companies, regulators, patient groups to try to improve access in trials. That's called the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance. But for our therapy session today, these views are just Craig's views.
Just so we don't get too far, the reason I ask that is because I'm thinking, if I'm a leader of a pharma company, how do you consult me to be bold? Like, what's your advice to leaders? How can they be bold? Like, what's the strategy? Like, should they change leadership? How do you do that?
Well, we're not going to do it just by doing very slow, deliberate traditional change management processes. The culture, the hiring, the job descriptions, the training, the incentives in many of our organizations have this conservative, risk-averse change avoidance culture incredibly deeply ingrained. And so, very simple little communication strategies or otherwise are simply alone not going to create meaningful change in our lifetimes. We as leaders do know the things that we need to do to make big change happen. And I think that as leaders, winning organizations will be bold here and not just rely on the comfort and safety of speaking at conferences about the use of digital, but in truth, not really mandating it internally. I'll share one example. I once was speaking at a large pharmaceutical clinical development organizations. There's sort of a global annual meeting they had. They had about 200 clinical operations leaders in the room. We spoke about a particular opportunity, great questions and discussion. At the end, the head of clinical development stood up and said to the group, "We should be doing these approaches for all of our studies." And I told him privately afterward that those words just killed any opportunity for adoption in the organization. And he looked at me surprised. I said, "The only thing your colleagues heard was the word should." And to them, should means that it's discretionary, it's optional, nobody's going to be rewarded or penalized or rewarded for having done it. And so those words matter. And if leaders in this case are saying things like we should be doing it, it's not going to happen.
So even you can think outside of pharma, which leaders inspire you in terms of making the change that you miss in this field, in the transition of digital and pharma, digital health, AI and pharma?
Well, I'll point to an example that was actually in the news today because they secured a second round of funding. It's a nonprofit program called Every Cure based out of Pennsylvania, led by a physician and patient, David Feigenbaum, who shares a great deal about his journey and story as a patient and how drug repurposing was a part of what helped to save and preserve his life. And so EveryCure is tackling what we in industry would talk about but might struggle to otherwise do. They're building a massive AI machine to be able to identify all of the matches to repurpose existing drugs to address other unmet needs. Now, some of this is hard for pharma to do because in some cases, these might not be as commercially interesting for them. But when we have the data and the evidence and the knowledge about about these medicines that are on the market, and we can start to share that data in smarter ways with platforms like EveryCure, nonprofit being led by, a patient story behind it, I think to me that's game-changing, inspiring, and going to drive meaningful change.
And how does that make you feel?
How does that make me feel? That makes me feel a sense of relief and hope. It makes me feel that in my lifetime in this field, we can see meaningful change and progress that will actually drive impact for patients. Pharma companies can come along on that journey. But like I was sharing in the conference session where we met today, if pharma companies aren't able to go fast enough, then they should get out of the left lane, pull over, and let others, groups like EveryCure, take the left lane. And the way they support that is with data sharing and other opportunities to make sure that at least some car is going to be passing, going fast, and helping to lead the way. And that gives me hope.
A lot of critique has been unveiled in this discussion that we are having. So how do you imagine that clinical trials and development could look like based on the available tools in 2024?
I think that in 2024, there is so much that we can do to drive improved engagement and inclusion, improved efficiency and automation.
Be specific.
Improved measurement. I think that when we think about our trials today and how we can decentralize these studies to make them more accessible and inclusive, how we can embrace and use digital measurements that better tell us how a patient is feeling and functioning, and do it in ways that didn't require a fatigued patient to have to travel miles and go through the subway and up a flight of stairs just to do a 6-minute walk test at the end of all of that in a clinical setting. I think, to me, I'm excited about the power of patient-led organizations to go beyond being invited to the table of pharma. I think that for the last few years, we've heard a lot of enthusiasm from really thoughtful, progressive pharma leaders about inviting patients to the table. But when you're inviting a patient to the table, it implies it's your table. And that's nice. It's nice to invite guests over, but it makes clear who's in control and who's setting the menu. And I think that we're at a precipice today that we're about to see ways that patient-led organizations are actually setting their own table. And the question for us in the coming year is whether those patient groups will invite pharma, because we see this democratization of the tools and the processes that are needed to develop medicines, and that we're at a point that no longer do you have to be a global multinational corporation to be able to run a drug development program. And are we at a place where patient-led organizations, nonprofit groups, and others will start to use these tools and show their power of being able to innovate in the drug development process on their own? That's a good thing for pharma at the end of the day. These groups can de-risk smart and novel approaches for pharma. And so again, if you can't go fast enough, it's okay. Just get out of the left lane so others can.
I'm wondering one thing. Why wouldn't pharma simply buy these organizations? Patient organizations often rely on pharma funding.
Patient organizations today rely on pharma funding for two reasons. When we're talking about, say you're a patient organization and you have intellectual property on a medicine that could be developed in a clinical trial, well, today the traditional clinical trial process is expensive and burdensome. There's a lot of expertise and know-how that's required. But we also have this perception, for instance, that a phase 2 trial costs $25 million. And we say that number that comes into whatever that number is that comes into our mind based on what our experience in pharma told us we paid for the last trial. And so I think we confuse very quickly what we in big pharma pay to run a study versus what it actually costs to generate evidence. What pharma pays to run a phase 2 development program is inclusive of a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of self-imposed conservatism, taxes and tariffs that do not need to be borne by other more agile organizations. There is a story that pharma could buy smart, agile organizations and try to pull them in. When we've seen that in the past, the antibodies of the larger organization can quickly kill the creativity and agility of the smaller that's been brought in. And we've seen that a few times, whether large pharma buying younger agile biotech companies or even interesting initiatives that some large pharma like Lilly have done with their Chorus platform to try and create a different space that can be a little more agile. But when you try to bring that back into the mothership, that agility and ability to move differently, it easily gets killed by the large organization.
Reminds me of the digital health accelerators inside of pharma that never really were unicorns, if I try to express myself in that way. I feel kind of
and
like...
how does that make you feel?
I'm a therapist in this context, so we are not talking about me.
We're
not talking about me. But I do feel like I'm a good cop and you're the bad cop. And you know, you're in pharma on a daily basis, and I'm not. I'm more on the healthcare IT side, and I'm just observing from the outside. And the things that I heard at the conference in the 3 days is that we're still kind of in the trying to figure things out phase with digital tools, but at the same time, I can't agree with you on that nothing is changing. You know, if I just look at in silico discovery of medications and platforms to support drug discovery, I think there's a lot of things happening in that space. So please enlighten me with your insider knowledge around these topics.
So a big pharmaceutical organization, often I think about as 3 different silos. Discovery, and there's a great deal of creativity there. Discovery often has folks fresh out of academia. This is where, you know, incredible technology is being used, and it's a very expansive part of the process. And in commercial, where folks are thinking about access and reimbursement and manufacturing, there's all sorts of creative energy. The challenge for us is that in this clinical development box in the middle, there are just so many incentives and reward structures to be predictable and to avoid risk. And so as a result, we have this innovation desert in the middle. And that's a desert that I think a lot of entrepreneurs and investors also have seen and felt that's an opportunity, and it theoretically is, but it's so many years ingrained that the culture in that part of the organization is particularly hostile to meaningful change. And again, it doesn't have to always be that way. It's just we have to embrace it with a different level of urgency and commitment to change than the somewhat softer approaches that leaders have taken in this space so far to date.
I think our time is running out. So I don't have a pen. I'm just going to pretend I'm writing things down.
Do you have a prescription for me for today? Is there a treatment that I should be embracing?
Many. But I will just ask, how do you feel now? Do you feel any better? Like you let all the things out?
You know why? Because I am an optimist. I am excited about the future. It's why I do what I do. And I've been blessed to be able to work with wonderful people in pharmaceutical companies, tech companies, and health systems and patient organizations. There is an amazing community, but I also know and respect the frustration that's felt with leaders that have this Harry Potter syndrome. They come to conferences and they are in their wizarding world. They come to conferences and it's like going to Hogwarts and they're with all the other magicians. But I know when they go back home, they often feel like they're being pushed into the cupboard under the stairs, back in the muggle world of their employment. And I think for us to create change, we just have to act with a sense of urgency and commitment that we haven't necessarily embraced there to date, but we can, and that's going to keep me optimistic. And so I do feel better. Thank you for our session today.
Thank you, Craig. I think we have a lot more work to do, but we will
think
continue next time.